Now we are on to the Swiss cheese plant. And it's some variety of Monstera, but I wasn't really sure which, so that's why I'm just calling it the Swiss cheese plant. And I gotta tell you, I really agonized about what stitch to use on this leaf. And I was really trying to avoid satin stitch because I know not everybody loves satin stitch, and we've already done some of it, or maybe a good bit of it on this pattern. And I'm sorry, but that's what I landed on because I tried several other techniques and stitches as a filling for these leaves, and none of them looked quite right. So before I talk to you about the satin stitch on this plant though, let me show you, if you really do not want to do satin stitch, here is an alternative. Here's one of the things that I experimented with. So ignore this one and ignore this one. This is my practice hoop where I was testing different things out. And this right here is what I almost went with. And it is split back stitch, and I used 2 strands. And what I did to fill in here, obviously it's not quite finished, and obviously I did not do the veins yet. But just see how it's kind of a rougher, more textured effect. And if you want to compare it right here to this one, this is what the satin stitching is going to look like. The satin stitching just looked more like the shiny, glossy Swiss cheese plant leaf. So if you want to do the split back stitch, I'm going to just talk to you briefly about that, and then we will get to the satin stitch is what I ended up using. So hang on a minute, let me get my little diagram here. All right, so if you do want to do the split back stitch and not the satin stitch, let me just talk to you really briefly about the direction of stitching. So I would go ahead and I would stitch the veins first, leave the center vein unstitched, just like the satin stitching. We're on the other leaf, we're going to do that last. But do these veins first with the split back stitch. And then if you want to do the split back stitch on this, what I did when I was working on my practice piece is I took each section, see how these veins separate each section. I took that as its own entity. So just like if we're just going to work on this one, just think about between here and here, this line and this line. And then I just sort of flowed around the holes. So I started up here and I would stitch a line that went down this way. And I would go back to the top and I would stitch a line that went this way until this was filled up. I don't remember how many lines it took. And then I would perhaps come right here and flow down this way and fill in here. Maybe do that however many lines it took to fill each section. So see how those individual lines basically flow around that section. This section I would just obviously do these crescents here, start up here, work down this side of the hole if you needed to, and then make some short lines. Same thing here, just flow down till it fills up if you need to put some short lines and fill that way. So that's how I did the split back stitch. If you just do not like satin stitch and you just don't want to do satin stitch on all of these leaves, then that's how you can use the split back stitch to fill these leaves. But having said all of that, I am going to use satin stitch for all of these leaves. And the first thing to do is to stitch the veins. Again, not the center stem, we're going to do that last. Stitch these wavy veins with 3 strands of thread and a split back stitch. So you don't need to watch me do that. I'm going to go do that right now. Before we move on to the next step, I want to explain why I did these outlines first. And a question I see all the time about satin stitching is, do you do the satin stitching first or the outlining first if you are going to have an outline around a satin stitch? Now, up here on the letters, when we're talking about an outline that we're going to stitch on top of, you know how we covered it up? Obviously, do that first, right? That's a no-brainer. But when you're talking about an outline that is going to show, I know this isn't a complete outline, but it is a line that's going to separate 2 areas of satin stitching. Normally, I say satin stitch first and outline second because it is much easier to do all your satin stitching and then outline on top of it, and that way that can cover the kind of maybe uneven edge, you know, the imperfect edge of your satin stitch. Or and the other main reason really is because it's really hard to bring that needle up. Like, let me get a needle here to show you. It is really hard to bring a needle up repeatedly over and over right next to that outline stitch without splitting it. Or if you do bring it up, you're kind of a little bit far away from it because you're trying to avoid splitting that stitch, and then your satin stitching has a little bit of a separation between the edge of the satin stitching and the outlining. That's why I usually say to satin stitch first and then outline the edge of it so you can kind of outline on top of it. I tried that on these leaves. It didn't work so great because of this kind of weird shape I'm having to, you know, these holes I'm having to stitch around. It was really hard once I got this section satin stitched and this section satin stitched. It was really hard to see where those veins were going to go to stitch them later. So in this instance, it kind of helps me to know the area I'm going to be satin stitching. It helps, you know, delineate it so I can see it better. So I am going to have to sort of work a little bit to not split these stitches when I come up with my needle, but in this instance, it was really the better plan. Speaking of outlining first and then satin stitching over that outline, that is what I'm doing with each of these holes. Because we are going to be satin stitching in some different directions, and I really want these holes to stand out a lot, to, you know, really show up, I am using 2 strands of thread, whatever color of leaf you're doing, thread you're using for that leaf, use the same color. And then I am doing a simple back stitch around each of these holes. And, you know, normally I revert to a split back stitch for an outline to stitch over for satin stitch, but that just, these are little tiny areas, and that just ended up to be a little too bulky. It just was kind of obliterating the holes, especially then after I satin stitched over on top of them. And honestly, it was just a little too much. So I just want a nice crisp outline to stitch over with my satin stitch. So that's why I'm using 2 strands of just a basic back stitch. This does not have to be any kind of award-winning back stitch because obviously it's going to be covered. Just my usual rule applies. You know what I'm going to say. Tiny curves, therefore tiny stitches. I mean, I do want it to be, you know, accurate around these circles. So I am trying to be accurate, but, you know, if your back stitch is a little wonky, it truly just doesn't matter. Now for filling these sections with the actual satin stitch. And as I mentioned for the alternative, when you were going to be doing the split, if you were going to be doing the split back stitch, I am taking each section as its own enclosed shape. So don't get freaked out by having to fill up this whole leaf. Let's just take it one section at a time, 1/2, and then like between the 2 wavy veins. All right. And probably the trickiest part of each of these leaves is figuring out the angle for your satin stitches. And I have to admit that I have to give myself a few minutes or just a little bit of time thinking about how I want the stitches to go. Now you could, let's just say we're doing this section right here first. So let me draw that one. Let's just pretend that's that one section. You could address, let me see if I can recreate this leaf right here. Here's this section and here's that section. Okay, so this half is right here. You could address each section and maybe go, you know, with any leaf, okay. All right, so with any leaf, I always like whatever angle of any kind of stitch I'm doing to sort of mimic a real leaf. And I usually start at the outside edge and work back towards, you know, this direction, outside edge towards the back side, just like these veins are. And so let's say you're just going to work on this section. You could do your satin stitch and just go straight stitches you could do that, and it would, you know what, that would probably look just fine. And then you could do this one this way, and you could do this one this way, you know, short stitches on either side of that hole. You could do that, and you know what, I think that would probably look really nice. The way I have chosen to do it is a little bit different, a little bit more organic. And I try to think of I still keep in mind that angle from here going back that way a little bit, but I try to again sort of think of the like one side of the hole and then the other side of the hole. So again, let's don't get freaked out by having to fill up this whole area. Let's just look, for instance, at this side. So well, actually, let me start right here. You're going to have to use a little bit of your technique of satin stitching in an arc, like we did on the friendship plant, you know, where you tuck some stitches under others because you're trying to change the angle as you go around. Well, that's what's happening on the tops of these leaves with this curve. So you're going to start heading off this way, and then you're going to start changing the angle as you go around, like that. All right, that one's pretty simple. There's no hole to deal with. Same thing up here. All right, now let's talk about this one. Back to this one side of the big hole and the other side. So I'm gonna still think of myself as kind of trying to work at these angles that go this way, but also to flow in this direction around the hole. So I am going to, perhaps I would maybe start this way and work down this half. And we've got the outline here. So on these right here, I'm going over, over, not these, but right here and here, all of these along this edge, I'm going over that outline. And then I might go to right there. And now I'm going to jump back up here just because, I mean, you could work from here back up, but if it kind of makes more sense in my head, just go back to the top and maybe go this way. And I mean, see, this is where it gets a little, you know, if you do it completely different, if your angles are different than mine, it is going to be fine. It's going to look just fine. But then maybe work down this way like that. Let's look at this one. You've got this outline here, same thing. You might start going at this angle. And then you might want to switch to this angle a little bit. And then kind of fold into you know, the angle that comes all the way down to this point. This section, pretty straightforward. I would just go all the way down like this. Same thing over here. Now we got to flow around this hole. You've outlined this one. I'm going to look at above the hole and on to the left of the hole and the right of the hole. So start this way and then angle down, making sure I go over the edge there. And then this is always the trickiest part, kind of on this end where you have to, one angle you're going this way and now you want to start going this way. But just like that. Those angles are going a little bit different, but that's fine. When you get up here, same thing. You've outlined this and maybe incorporate a little bit of your arc again. So start here. Then now you got to start arcing, you know, arching around there. All right, so see, it looks a little random sometimes, and these angles are kind of maybe going at, you know, competing angles. But once you get it all done, it just has a nice, it just looks kind of glossy. So I can show you this practice one while we're here talking about it. So here's this one again, not finished again, but you probably can't even see some of these different angles, like right in, like here, it's kind of hard to see, but right here, this angle is going this way, And then right here, they're kind of going at more of this way. And it's fine. You can't even tell. It's fine. This one is a little sloppy. Honestly, I got a little bit better as I stitched more. And this little hole is small. But once you get it all stitched, it will look a lot more cohesive. So that is me saying don't sorry about that. Don't stitch, one area or an area and a half and say, I hate this, it's looking awful. Keep going and you'll kind of find your rhythm, and you'll find your rhythm with your angles, and I promise it will be better. So now let's get to the actual stitching. Just like I was saying, if you want, I did not choose to. You could take the same 2 strands and you could outline with a backstitch around the outside edge of the leaf. You could absolutely do that and it would probably look really good. I just was tired of outlining and I wanted to get to the satin stitching, so I didn't do that. But if you wanted to do that, it would be fine. I think it would look really nice, actually. So I'm going to be careful on that outside edge, because that edge will be, there's not going to be an outline on top of it. But let me get a little bit further into it. It's easy on this side because I'm going down next to that split back stitch, so I don't have to worry about coming up next to it. But I'm going to start changing my angle here. Probably, I think I'll need to go back and maybe add a little stitch right here. Teeny tiny space. But since I've already drawn it for you, you don't necessarily need to watch me do this whole shape. Let me get this one stitched, and then we'll talk about, I'll show you this one that is a little trickier. I've been stitching on this one a little bit, and so I've started up here and all the way around here. I used my satin stitching in an arc technique where I started at this angle, and in order to change the angle, I would tuck some stitches under, and now I'm trying to make this angle come around a little bit more this way, so it'll kind of mimic that, this line around like that. I am starting on the outside edge and stitching over the outline of the hole, the 2-strand back stitch over the hole. If you want to, and up here I had to be careful not to split those stitches of the lighter colored split back stitch. If you want to start on, say you're over here, if you want to start on this side and stitch over to here and tuck that needle under those, you could certainly do that. Nothing wrong with that. But I'm slowly changing this angle as I work around. Again, being careful with where I bring my needle up here on the outside edge to get a nice smooth outline. I think I forgot to say I'm using 3 strands, and I chose 3 because I wanted it to have a little bit of bulk, isn't the right word, but a little bit of texture, and 2 strands was just a little bit flat, a little bit thin. And I think when I did the diagram that I was drawing for you, I probably kind of misled you. I could absolutely jump, now that I've come all the way down here, I could start back up here, but honestly I think I am going to work my way back up this way. That's one of those things that just doesn't matter, really. Whatever makes sense to you. So I'm gonna work up this way, keeping in mind the angle that I'm trying to sort of end up at. And right now I'm working at this angle, and honestly, if I can just kind of keep working up, we'll see. It's gonna be a little different when I get up there, and I'll just make those 2 sections meet. I finished stitching that section, and I just completely went rogue. I did it, especially the angles up here, I did them much differently than I explained in my drawing right here. And I did it completely differently than the same exact leaf, which is right here, This section is the one I just stitched here and here, and it's different. So you know what? The moral of that story is it's not really going to matter. If your angles are different, I couldn't even do them identical on the same leaf, the same section. So just fill in with satin stitch that in a way that makes you happy, that you enjoy, and it will look great. It'll be fine. I am going to stitch this leaf and speed it up for you. So if you do not like watching those hyperlapse videos, you know, with stitching really fast, if it makes you a little dizzy or a little nauseous, that's totally fine. I get it. Just skip over that part. But sometimes it's nice to see it sped up so you can sort of get a feel for the flow of how I'm doing it. But like I said, if yours is different from mine, that's okay.